Hey everybody, welcome to FCS Express Ask an Expert FAQs session. We'll be starting in just a few minutes here. YouTube has probably just sent out the links to let everybody know that we're now live. So I'll give everybody a couple minutes to join us, but I'm looking forward to hearing your questions today. We've got a couple of questions from those who have written in to support asking some questions to us about FCS Express, and we'll be looking at those. But if you have any questions, you're definitely welcome to ask them in real time and get your answers in real time also. Hi, everybody. We are live. We're waiting just a couple of minutes to let some people settle in and get into our live space so that you can answer or ask your questions in real time, and we will be able to provide you answers during our live stream today. Today, we'll be talking about frequently asked questions. We've had a couple people write in asking some questions that they'd like to see us cover today, so we're going to cover those questions. And of course, if you have anything to add, please feel free to do so. We are happy to answer those questions in real time. My colleague Holly Bonner is here to join me on this Ask an Expert session, and she's going to have some valuable input to also give you some support and help you use FCS Express a little more efficiently and effectively. All right, looks like we are right at the top of the hour. So let's go ahead and dive right in to Ask an Expert today. It is our Freestyle Friday, going with the flow. We do start off with a little bit of a funny because we want flow cytometry to be fun and enjoyable. And so here we are looking at some cells here, and this little stem cell is saying, but I'm so confused. And this older Stella is like, when I was a little stem cell, I didn't know what I wanted to be either. So thought that was cute, a good little way to get us started and break the ice. So today we're going to start looking at some of the frequently asked questions from our users and what we get into with the questions we receive in our support. So some of the things that we get a lot of questions about are about our user options. So we're going to dive into that first. So this first tab we're going to look at is going to be how we can tell the software to do exactly what we want it to do when we're setting up some of the functionality. One thing that comes up quite a bit is how FCS Express remembers parameters. And this comes up because if you look here, it says in new layouts, remember parameters by number. There's a drop-down menu, and you can also choose name. If you choose number, your layout that you create is married to this for life. It cannot be adjusted. It cannot be modified. It will always remember those parameters by number. Now, like I said, there are some good things and bad things from doing either way. Number is decided by the instrument, so it does decide the number order, and it also determines the name. We have some options where we can customize how FCS Express looks at that name if you wanted to include name and stain, and we'll be looking at that a little bit later when we look at instrument-specific settings. Holly, what are some of the questions that you've seen related to how FCS Express remembers parameters?
So usually this comes up, we don't get a lot of questions where people are asking us, like, how does FCS Express remember parameters? It's always like, I have this layout and I've tried to load some data and now it looks crazy. Or like my axes don't look right and it doesn't load properly. Like, what does that mean? And a lot of times it comes from if somebody's changed their tube or they've added a fluorochrome or an antibody to their tube or they've taken one away. So something that's going to make the number of parameters change, and then that's going to, disrupt how the data loads into the layout. So when something like that happens, you can always kind of have this in the back of your mind, like, oh, maybe this has to do with how the layout is remembering my parameters, and maybe I need to do something with that.
Yep, absolutely. So moving to our next thing, I often hear about displaying multiple data sets. So in some of our data files, we have the ability to store what's called like data sets. So LMD files is a perfect example of that. Inside those LMD files, you get two different data sets. We also have other instruments that do the same strategy and kind of tuck data sets inside of there. So if we go to data loading and look at our FCS files options here, you'll be able to see that you can check this box to allow multiple data sets. When this box is checked, then you'll be able to see those data sets. Now, the caveat here is that you have to also go to your dialogues, open data dialog, and check to use this advanced open dialog data. What this does when you bring in your data, you'll be able to see the data file. You'll also be able to see in the subset window that you'll be able to select those data sets. All right, now moving on to instrument specific settings. This is kind of a big deal. There's a lot of things here. One that comes up a lot for me is my SciTech users. With SpectraFlow, when you bring in that spectral data, if you're bringing in raw data, sometimes you'll be like, oh my gosh, I can only see my forward and side scatter parameters. There are no other channels. What happened to my data? And this one comes up super often. So one of the ones that I constantly am responding to and support is by default, we have this box checked to delete fluorescent parameters after spectral merge. And what this is designed to do is because a lot of people are unmixing on the instrument, we didn't want you to have to manage extra parameters that you may not be interested in. So if you have this box unchecked, you would see those unmixed parameters, and then you would see all the other channels as well. Now, when you're working with raw data, however, you get your scatter parameters. So that can be a little terrifying at first, but if you come in here and just uncheck this box, those parameters won't be deleted, and you'll be able to see all of your channels from the instrument. Holly, how many times have you heard this
Oh my
question or
gosh,
gotten this question?
over and over again. And I think it's important too to point out that, like, it says delete, parameters, but it's not modifying your data files, right? So if you have that problem and you see that those parameters aren't there, it's just like Robin said, you can come in and uncheck that, and reload the data, and then they will show up. So not to worry, we're not we're not actually like modifying your raw, or your, not just your raw, but your actual FCS files. So this is an easy fix. It's just a matter of knowing where to go to fix it.
Oh, I love that because that is really important. We do not modify your raw
Yep.
data at all. We're just simply telling the software not to display any of those different parameters.
Yep, I would panic too if I was doing a 30 parameter experiment and all of a sudden I just saw forward and side scatter. So,
Yeah, it can be a little much when you're like, oh my gosh, like there's nothing, there's nothing,
yep,
I did nothing, I did it all wrong. So if you're a new user, don't worry, it's not you, it's just a button and you just need to uncheck a box there and you'll be good to go.
yeah. And
Now,
the really nice thing before we go, like once you uncheck this button, it will stay unchecked. So going forward, you should definitely see all those parameters. You won't have to come in and check it and uncheck it. That's the whole point of these user options, is to come in and make these, change whatever you want about the way that the layout works, and then you don't have to change it again going forward.
yep, that is one of my favorite features also, because then I can make those changes and not have to worry about it. And with these instrument specific settings, you can add different instruments, right? So you can also control how your data is being displayed. It's telling FCS Express what you want to see, how you want those parameters to be scaled, but you can also do a really broad version, right? If we just want to do a default FCS file, if there are no instrument settings above here, because that is the priority, if there are any instrument specific settings, it will use those first. If not, it will go to this default parameter for your FCS files. Here we are going to start talking about these general options. So you'll see these for each instrument as well as this FCS file. And this is telling FCS Express how you want your parameters to be named and then how you want to match that keyword for parameter matching. Remember in the beginning when I said how FCS Express can remember your parameters by number or name. If you're using name here, you do have some options to modify and tell FCS Express how you want that name to be remembered. Now, most importantly, I get this often, is like I'm displaying my parameters on the axes, but it's not showing my antigen, or it's not showing my floor. Here is where we would modify that. So using this drop box, we can use name. Name is from the instrument. So this is just how the instrument has named a detector, or a filter, whatever is named from the instrument is going to be shown here. Stain is anything that the user inserts into their acquisition software. And then name and stain, or stain and name, is just kind of prioritizing. Do I want the name first and then my stain? Do I want stain and then name? I can just kind of organize that however that works. And then the last one, because my image users, I haven't forgotten about you. We do have some options for you for your from your instruments here. See if I can go here. For your instruments, sometimes you will need to come in here and check a box. So like if I'm using an Amnis and I can't see my images and I can't seem to figure out what's going on, if I come to my user options and click this box, I'll be able to load those images into this FCS Express and then use those images along with my data analysis. All right, moving on to axes. We touched on this a little bit in the last one. The question that comes up a lot in the support is like, I loaded my new data file and all of a sudden my axes are displaying the wrong parameter. Robin, what happened? So I'm going to show you this really quickly. I'm going to introduce my data list here and drag it over onto the right screen. There we go. And I have created a sample here where I've removed a parameter, so it's kind of like showing you exactly what would happen. So this plot on the right is the one I want you to focus on. We have a side scatter and CD4 with my first data file. This is how I created my layout. I've got this new data file from my new experiment, and when I load it, it's now saying CD19. So my side scatter was able to be maintained, but my I have CD19 here, and I'm expecting it to be CD4. When I look at my gate, it's still CD4, and I'm like, okay, what happened? This goes right back to what we were talking about of how FCS Express remembers those parameters names. So if I view the header here, I'm going to see I have 7 parameters with this data file. So that means that number is how my layout is remembering parameters in this specific layout. And so if I move back to that other data file and do view header, I'm going to see this one has 9 parameters. And sometimes when you take out a parameter or add new ones, it's not really sensical. It doesn't just go at the end so that it would just be a nice transition. The instrument decides how that goes. So sometimes when you add a new parameter, it's going to be like, yeah, that goes in number 6 or that goes in number 3. So everything downstream gets shifted. It just is really up to the instrument how it handles parameters. And so this is a big thing that we see a lot. All right. Holly, how many times have you seen that question?
Oh, like 100 times, right? And
This week.
and I think people don't even realize that that's a big deal. Like taking out a parameter or inserting a parameter, and like how much of it is driven by the instrument, like you were saying. So it's like this would be so much easier if there was a way to renumber parameters or to insert things where you wanted them to and kind of put them in the order you wanted so that things looked right. But the instrument, every individual instrument will write things differently, and they write things in a different order, and they kind of have a different logic for how they do that. Kind of once you wrap your brain around how that works, it makes sense and you don't panic. But it's definitely one of those panic-inducing things that happens, especially if you've got a really big layout that's a number of pages and a number of gates and everything. It's not just like what you have here. It's like everything on every page looks wonky. If it's inserted or deleted a parameter near that top by those scatter parameters, and then the 30 parameters underneath of it don't match up, it can get
Yeah,
pretty wonky pretty quick.
that is so that is so true. All right, and now the next one I've seen a lot is talking about how our scales, right? So when we look at our data files, we want to make sure that we're kind of looking at all of our data files through the same scaling. What can happen is because when you would bring your data into FCS Express, it does an automatic feature. So it adjusts it so that you can see it as best as you can here. Now, if I extend my gate, like I'm going to make this a little wonky intentionally, just so I can show you this shift a little bit better. So here we have like 10 to the -4 on this X parameter here. When I go back to 3 though, oops, let me cancel that. If I go back to my third iteration here, you can see that it's 10 to the third and I'm like, oh, Robin, like I really need my data to look consistent across these things. So I get that. And so we get this question a lot, like how do I fix this scale so it's not bopping around from sample to sample? Well, this is a really easy fix, fortunately. What we can do is we can select that plot, and then we can use this drop-down menu. We go to our axes, and here we have linear for our side scatter, so that's great. This is always a good indicator. If you're using two floors, you sometimes forget that there's two different tabs here for y-axis and x-axis, but if you're like, oh, this is linear, like, oh, not the right thing, click on my x-axis, and then I can see I have my bi-exponential here. If I uncheck this automatic box, I can either calculate it automatically, but this will also sometimes lead to some shifting if I let, it calculate from using this method. So you can also set a value. So if I wanted to be very specific here, I can be like, okay, I want my data to look like this. I can use this slider bar to adjust it. Maybe that's a little much. Maybe something like this is great. And this is how I want to use this value. And then when I pop to the next one, I don't see those shifts that I saw before, right? It's got that same nice scaling, and I'm just seeing my data move. It shifts up and down a little bit on that side scatter, but it's not moving left to right anymore on that X parameter. So that brings me to the next thing. I've seen a lot of people that like, hey, I just want to see this segment of my data. I either want to expand it, just make it present a little bit differently. A lot of people go and automatically go to this range section. Now, range can be really great, but if I go to a very small range, I can sometimes introduce these little blank lines in between my data set. It looks kind of like a tiger just went through my population, and I have these little white lines or stripes that go through my data set. If you see that, what's happening is whenever we bring data into a plot to display it, we do what's called binning. So we have like little bins where all the data and the events go, and we create little sections so we know how to display them on a plot. Now, range can be great if you're not seeing that feature, but I always recommend if I'm going to do something to kind of adjust the region that I'm interested in, to use resolution here. And that's under our specific options, or you can right click and use a magnify resolution option, and you can do that with your axes as well. But I like resolution because it does two things. It allows me to look at a specific range of data, and then it rebins that data within that range to give it a really nice presentation. So it really is clean, it looks great, and I'm looking at the range of data that I want to use. That's probably one of the features that I really like when I'm really kind of honing in and want to see a specific segment of data.
Yeah. So for me, range is the last thing I try. If I'm having problems with my plot and I don't like the way the data is sitting on the axes, I almost always now go to specific options and automatic minimums and maximums, because a lot of times what people want to do is to move it up on the axis or move it over on the axis. And that's automatic minimum and maximum in specific options does that quite nicely for you. Whereas range, if you're changing the range and it's outside of what you have on your plot, then sometimes you can get that really stretched effect too. So people will write in saying they're having trouble with scaling, and now everything looks like it's stretched, like they've literally pulled it. And you'll get that a lot by using the range, but you won't see that if you do automatic minimum and maximum in the specific option. So I always
Yeah,
encourage people to try that first before they start messing with the range.
yeah, that is so true about that stretching. I have seen that before.
Yep,
Now,
it gets real fuzzy too. So not only does it look stretched, but they don't look as crisp anymore, and that's just because you're trying to pull that data across a range that's really not appropriate for the data. Whereas that minimum maximum will move it up and down if you are too far squashed on one side or the other.
yeah, that's a great point. Now, I wanted to talk about something that I have heard about recently. So we added this feature to remember the scale formula. And what this means, if I come into my axes here and I decide, bi-exponential isn't working for me, I want to change this to, lin log or something of that nature, you'll see that not just my top plot changed, but my histogram plot changed also. So what this does when it remembers the scaling for us, it will apply it to this parameter throughout my entire layout. Sometimes that's great, and it's fine because this new scaling works just as fine in these other plots as it does in the original plot where I changed it. Sometimes it's not, and I've gotten a customer support ticket just recently where they're like, all right, so I changed the scaling on one plot, and then suddenly my other plot, I can't even find my populations from, and what happened? So this new feature that I'm talking about, the remember scale the formula, there's two places you can find it. So stepping back for a minute, if we go back to those user options, this is the global setting. So it means it will apply to everything that you create new in FCS Express. So all your new layouts will remember the scalar formula for manually scaled plots. But there's also a local setting for this one. So if you're like, hey, Robin, that's unchecked. I don't know why it's still doing this. Like what? It's broken. If you go to File and Info, you'll see in our layout options, we actually have some of our options to be present here as well. So if your layout, remember we set that as an option in the beginning for user options to remember by number. When I get to my layout options, it's married. I can adjust it. This is going to be remembered by number forever, but I can make some adjustment to things like remember the scale formula. So if you're seeing like, ooh, yeah, I don't want it to use it for everything. I want to be able to change my scaling on one plot and not on another, just uncheck this box and click OK. And then you'll be able to just modify on your one plot here. Right, so then I can change this and it's not changing this bottom histogram for me. It's just limited to this one plot. Now compensation. So we did ask an expert on compensation. This comes up all the time. Adjusted compensation won't stay in my files, right? So FCS Express uses compensation and there's a lot of flexibility here. We can use it from the software if we set it to a default. We can pull it from the FCS file. We can say none, or we can kind of prioritize, right? So maybe most of the time I want to use my FCS file, but if it's not in my FCS file, I want it to use the default, or vice versa. I want to use the default all the time, and then if it's not there, use my FCS file. So what can happen in this instance, I am using the data file for my compensation here. So when I look at this plot, it's going to be using the compensation from the sample itself. So this is donor tube 2, and that's the compensation that it's using. Now, if I needed to make some adjustments here, I can do that, grab my compensation here, adjust these, right? We'll do something wonky just so you can see it. This is not the best approach, right? We want to have great controls so that we don't modify our compensation, but if you need to do something to just make a small minor adjustment, you can do that. And we'll click OK here. Now, when I go back to that compensation window, I'm going to see this red square that says, okay, something has changed. But because the way FCS Express is remembering some of my compensation here, if I move to my next data file and then move back, you'll see that I've lost those changes. So really important here to know how FCS Express is using your compensation. And also, if you do make changes to a matrix for whatever reason, you want to right click this, copy it, paste it under created manually. This would have been my adjusted one had I not moved around. And then there's one more step. You have to manually set this to default, right? And once we set it to default, it won't matter where I go, what data file I'm looking at. When I right click, I'm going to see this second compensation here that's under my created manually. See, now it's donor tube 2, FCS1. That's the name that it gave me when I moved it to my created manually folder. So now you can see that no matter which file I'm using, it's going to use that compensation that I just created.
Yeah, I think
So
an easy way to think about this is, I think a lot of people think that the only way you're doing a manual compensation is if you calculate compensation using the wizard in FCS Express, right? And that's certainly a manual compensation. But as soon as you take a compensation that came automatically with your data files and you modify it, and there's a number of reasons why you would want to do that, it becomes a manual compensation, right? Because you've manually done something to it. And so if you think about it that way, in that, okay, now I have a manual compensation because I've made a change to my existing comp, so I need to make sure I apply it the same way I would do a manual compensation. Because you're right, this is usually where people think, oh, I didn't realize I had to make something a default. I didn't realize I had to do this because I'm using the comp from the instrument. But as soon as you make a change to it, it becomes manual, and so you just need to make sure you apply it correctly, and then it works pretty well.
I love that. And then another place that you can see what compensation is being applied, if you do have, like, if you're looking at your data and you're like, I don't think this is the right compensation, on our format window under overlays, it is going to tell you what compensation is being used. And if you have other compensations, you can, use your drop down plot, but you do want to make sure that one, if it's something that you did modify manually, that it's set to default, because otherwise you'll run into the same thing. You'll move to the next data file and it will update for you to whatever the default behavior is to use compensation.
Yep. And that's a nice way to do some comparisons between your comps as well. So maybe you calculate, most people are calculating compensation at the instrument. but maybe you don't like the way that looks, or maybe you want to do a more mixed media option that's not as easy to do on your instrument. Using this drop down here is a good way to kind of flip through the different compensations you have to kind of see which one is going to work better for you.
Yep, I agree. Now the mixed media, thank you so much for bringing that up because that comes up a lot. Hey, Robin, I'm using cells for my live dead, and for the rest, I'm using beads. Okay, so how we work our compensation is that we use a scatter gate, right? And this scatter gate is used and is the primary gate for all of our stained, unstained markers as we go forward. So you don't want to come in here and have to make a new scatter gate, right? Like I don't want to break this scatter gate. So it's like, what do I do? How can I fix this? Well, fortunately, you can use our data specific gate option. So I like to click it because I'm very visual. Once you click it, you see this gray background, and then I can move this independently. So you'll notice that my beads gate hasn't changed, but now for my cells over here, I'm able to grab just my cells population. So now I'm working with the same scatter gate, and I'll be able to still use all those downstream markers that were being applied to the scatter gate itself. So it gives me a little bit of flexibility so that I can do cells and beads and still get great compensation in FCS Express. All right, data and statistics. Okay, so iterations comes up all the time. Hey, Robin, I'm working with my data. It was going really well. I was working through my analysis, and suddenly all of my samples are grayed out. So I'm going to give you an example of here how to break this first. So I'm going to drag out this sample, just create a density plot. And looks like, okay, it looks like it might have changed everything, or it's very happy with me today. I'm not really sure. Usually it's not so friendly. But what can happen here, maybe if I drag out this other tube here, and there we go. So I just needed to move one more step here. So see what has happened here is FCS Express will try to remember the order in which you're using your data set. So if I use sample 1 and 3 or sample 1 and 4 while I'm working through my analysis, well, it will try to keep that pattern. So if I did 1 and 4, it would be 2 and 5, 3 and 6, 4 and 7. And then when I got to sample 5, there was no 8. So it would break the pattern. And so then anything from 5 on would be grayed out. Right now, because I did the whole spread of data, you see that 2 through 7 is deactivated pretty much. And you won't be able to like do batch processing or let the software do that. So we do have a lot of options to help you manage your data. And this is important because we want to be able to optimize the use of batch processing to get those reportables out. We want to be able to move through our data in an expected way to get the most out of using the software, right? So panels and controls are super awesome. We've done a great job with implementing stationary controls. There is on the data tab where you can tell the software like, hey, I want to use different increments or set stationary controls here. But why I like panels is it is a way for the software to like always remember how we're using data files. It's like a kind of a cheat sheet. Like, hey, tube 1 goes on page 1, tube 4 goes on this page or whichever. And it kind of allows FCS Express to help you get data in the right places without you doing as much work. So all we have to do to add that panel is click on add. We got to give it a name. And then we can tell, the software, hey, I want 3 tubes. So maybe I'm using 3 tubes, 3 different population tubes here, and then I have 2 controls. You can introduce this information however you'd like. Once you have it in there, you have the ability to name it. So if I wanted to do T cells, B cells, NK cells, I can write in that information. I'll know which order my data goes in. Also, I can do the same with my stationary controls, right? I can add some stationary controls here. I can say FMO for CD4 or, some population that's giving me some headache or whatever other kind of controls that I have. Maybe it's just a universal control. Like, so I have a positive sample that I know if it looks like this, I have a positive in my test sample. Whichever those are, you can introduce those, give them some name. And then when I click OK again, you'll see that my data list is good. Let me see if maybe it's thinking here. It's going to update. So I have those 2 controls here, and then I have those 2 iterations at the bottom where I can use my data and kind of move through a little differently. Great news, if you don't need it, no biggie. Don't delete it because you might want to come back to it. Just uncheck it, say okay. It'll go back to using data how it was. If you do see your data gets a little wonky, no worries. On your View tab, Data Navigator will tell you how data files are being used. So we have some compensation up there because I was looking at some compensation earlier. But you'll see here like, oh, Everything else is using this donor tube 1 sample, and then I have this donor tube 1 sample here that is kind of the weird one, right? So when you highlight anything, you'll see that it will highlight the plot, so it will also move you to different pages. But when I'm here, I'm like, okay, so yep, that's the guy that I need to change, and I need to change it to this donor tube 1. So I can just simply drag and drop here. Now that's resolved. All my iterations are happy. They're blue and ready to go. I can use my batch processing tools. Holly, what are the challenges that you've seen with iterations?
Oh, I would say the same. Usually it winds up with, I see it more often, or I have people write into support when they're doing histograms rather than dot plots. So if you are if your data analysis leads you to be doing histograms with histogram overlays, a lot of times that will gray up iterations, because what's not as obvious here is that when you have a histogram overlay, you have multiple files on that plot, right? And so it intuitively sort of feels like you don't, because it's a single plot, but you do have multiple files there. And so it's going to function exactly the same way as what Robin was describing when you try to move through your batch. FCS Express is going to try to load those 2 files every time it moves to an iteration, and at some point everything's going to go gray because it's not going to know what to do. But there is a nice easy fix, because a lot of times you want that overlay, you want those data files to be showing, but maybe you don't want them to move through the batch the same way that you would your other iterations. So just like she's showing there, you can go to the overlays of that plot, and there's that button there that says change data file during next previous batch. And so if you uncheck that, you'll see that all of your iterations turn blue again, because now the software can move those files through all the rest of your analysis, and it will hold those overlays there where they are. So
That is perfect. Now, another question that I've seen twice this week, I don't know if it's just statistic weeks, is about percent of gated. So FCS Express does handle statistics a little bit different. Whenever we display a population or a gate on a given plot, so if I go here to my gating tab and throw on my cells gate, for instance, if I create other gates downstream, when I click to right click to do gate statistics, I will see the relationship. So here we have our, I apologize, I still have my compensation files here from when we were looking at that scatter gate and making a data specific gate, but like I have a CD4 gate here. Now this percent of gated from plot is relative to that cells gate. So our statistics will always reflect the relationship to the population that's being displayed on the plot. And so if you do percent of parent for the CD4 gate, you may be expecting to see the relationship to the cells, right? Because that is the parent gate for the CD4. But what you're actually going to get is the parent to the cells gate. So it would be the relationship from the CD4 gate to the no gate here. And here, what we would see then, we would see that 10.24%. And you'd be like, okay, but it's not matching my plot. Like, what happened? Why is the statistic looking weird? Or why isn't the relationship the way that I expected? Kind of knowing how that works, that the parent is always the parent to the population that's displayed, or the grandparent is the grandparent as relative to the population being displayed on the plot. Fortunately, we have gotten very wise, and when we insert a statistic, we have the ability now to insert a customized denominator gate. And so what I can do, if I have a really big hierarchy and maybe I need to go back 6 generations or whichever, right? Like we get some serious gating strategies going here. I can select my gate, I can select percent of all, and then I can use this to determine which gate I want to find a relationship to. So I can go back much further than grandparent. I can go anywhere in my hierarchy and I can define that relationship, right, to this new population. And any of the gates that you've defined, you'd be able to establish that relationship. All right, and now with our new release, we did update how we're naming statistics. So one question that came in recently was about, hey, I have used this layout forever. I updated to the newest release and I exported my Excel, and now my names of in the columns, I just don't know what happened there. but they look different than what they used to. We wanted to give you some more flexibility in how we name our statistics. So going back to those user options again, on our statistics here, if we expand this, we have some statistic naming options. So this is kind of the default, what you would see if you open this up. You can customize this. There's drop-down options, and you can specify how you want your statistics to look when you're reporting them out. So if you did see something change between your last version and now, this is likely where that change occurred. That with this customization and this more flexibility to get more information about those gates out into reportables, we have changed how we approached that. So we are running a little bit long, but that's okay. This was an excellent session, and I hope that we've answered some questions that you may have. If if we didn't get to your question today, or you do have some additional questions or even a topic suggestion, please follow up with us and reach out to us at support@denovosoftware.com. We are here to support you. These Ask an Experts are really just another way to reach us without having to use traditional methods. You don't have to call us, you don't have to write in, you don't have to wait for an email or look it up on our website. You can send us a suggestion, send us our question. We'll get back to you. And if you're okay with it being answered here, then we'll get you covered on our next Ask an Expert, or you can just in our chat box, right? You join us live, you introduce it in the chat box, and we can answer those questions for you live as well. Thank you so much for your time. It is always a pleasure being able to meet you in these live streams. And if you haven't done so already, looking at FCS Express maybe as a possible solution for your data analysis, here, go ahead and try it out on our website. We do offer a full functional 30-day trial of FCS Express to see if this is a good software for you. Our support team is excellent. We are always having screen shares to give you customized training to answer those questions and make sure that you don't feel alone when you're transitioning to FCS Express. All right, Holly, did I miss anything?
No, I think we covered it for today. I think it's always important for everybody to remember that if you have a question about something, it's likely that other people do too. So go ahead and ask that question, because not only will you get your question answered, but you'll probably be helping other people as well. And we like to answer questions, so definitely send those to us.
And also, some of these questions that we answered live today are from users that wrote into support about some things that they would like to see and kind of get some more information on. So please feel free to reach out. We want to support you. We want to give you another way to get some support without maybe having to go through those traditional methods. We're going to try to do these every 2 weeks. With the upcoming holidays, we are going to take a little bit of a break. So we'll see you in those first couple of weeks of January. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope that you find this helpful. We'll be seeing you soon.